Hello, everyone. Welcome to Subtle Asian Book Club. We're so excited to be talking about our September book of the month, the wonderful and amazing Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. For those of you guys who don't know us, my name is Tiffany. I'm one of the co-hosts of Subtle Asian Book Club, and I'm here with Alexandra, who is another co-host of Subtle Asian Book Club. And with us, we have Kuang, who is the author of Babel. So if you could please introduce yourself. Many of our book club members are very familiar with your works, but please introduce yourself and your books.
Hi guys, thanks so much for having me. My name's Rebecca. It's just RF on the book covers. I wrote the Poppy War trilogy, The Poppy War, The Burning God, and The Dragon Republic. That was out of order. Babel is my fourth novel, and I've got two more in the works, so busy drafting along. When I'm not writing, I am studying for my PhD in East Asian languages and literatures. So I am in the thick of coursework right now. So I'm constantly tired and distracted, but very glad I could make time on this weekend to chat with y'all.
Yay! Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us. And speaking of courseworks, let's jump right into talking about Babel, which is set in Oxford, where you obtained a master's in contemporary Chinese studies. How did your time at Oxford inspire Babel, and what did the research process look like when you yourself were a student engrossed in academia like Babel's cohort?
I think I have always been very inspired by place, and whatever I write at the time depends a lot on where I'm living at the time. So when I started writing The Poppy War, I was on a gap year in Beijing and walking to ancient temples just casually every morning, because in ancient cities like Beijing, you can do that. You can go from a Starbucks to a temple that's been around for centuries within 10 minutes. And I think being steeped in all of that culture and history and the language made me write exactly that. Something that dealt with 20th century Chinese history with a more ancient China aesthetic. And similarly, when I was at Oxford, I mean, Oxford is such a magical place. Every time I'm back there, I feel such deep nostalgia for it. It's utterly gorgeous, and it's a place that really leans into the romance of itself. The rad cam, the little rituals, the scones and the tea, and I think everybody who passes through Oxford, or novelists who pass through Oxford, end up writing their own version of an Oxford novel. Philip Pullman has his magical version of Oxford. Samantha Shannon has her magical version of Oxford. I have my magical Oxford. So I think while I was there, I was just so wrapped up in the illusion of the place. And that got me thinking very hard about the dark academia genre and how so much of it is precisely about the illusion of a beautiful elite institution, those hollowed halls, the marble statues, the libraries. And then I started tooling around with what lies behind that illusion and what sacrifices do people have to make to maintain it, and what happens when you strip all that glamour away. So I think those are the seeds of the themes that Babel ultimately grapples with. And then from there, I mean, I approach research for my novels the way I approach research for term papers, which is I start with research encyclopedias, and then I form a bibliography, and then I read around that bibliography and look through the footnotes for more sources, and then mass just hundreds and hundreds of pages of material. And the kind of keywords that I used when I was getting a sense of what arguments I wanted to make with Babel included histories of Oxford, colonialism in 19th century England, colonialism, and the foundation of elite institutions. I ended up doing so much reading about not just the foundation of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, but also Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. And these places are so intricately tied to slavery and colonialism. They're not just symptomatic, or they're not places that happen to be benefited by money from those historical phenomena, but rather established for the purpose of perpetuating them. there is all this great research about how Harvard, Yale, William and Mary College, etc., they were founded just to perpetuate slave societies and to propagate the projects of settler colonialism. So once I got into those weeds, there was no getting out. And that's ultimately the argument that BABEL makes, that what's dark about dark academia is the institutions themselves, which is something that I think a lot of dark academia doesn't grapple with enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting, because I know we romanticize, or people like to romanticize dark academia a lot, but it's really cool how you strip that away and talk more about what's at the crux of it. I don't know what I'm saying, but yes. So moving on to the next question. BABEL is peppered with footnotes of research and translation notes. How has your work as a translator influenced the way you approach the writing style and research process? Additionally, why did you decide to include the footnotes in the narrative of the story? They were incredibly fun to read, and as a reader, sometimes blurred the line of nonfiction research and also fiction storytelling.
I loved working on the footnotes. I wanted to do something with footnotes ever since I was very young and read Jonathan Stroud's The Bartimaeus trilogy, which is great fun. I always get excited when I meet other adults for whom that is a seminal part of their childhood. But he uses footnotes to great effect in that he constantly breaks the fourth wall and has the main character Bartimaeus whisper aside to the reader information and backstory and fun little anecdotes that the other characters don't know about. So I've always been enamored of that way of doing dual narration, having the main text proceed along and having a separate storyline proceed in the footnotes. And when I read Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, this renewed my adoration of footnotes, which academically was a habit that I'd fallen deep into and never planned to stop using. Because footnotes are just this wonderfully convenient way to shove in everything that you need to cut from the main argument for pacing, but you think is so cool that you need your reader to know. You need to see the research you've done and to know all this little squirrely asides that you wish you could have taken them along. So I was already a footnotes abuser, and when I wrapped up the popular trilogy, which is a kind of story I think that doesn't lend itself super well for footnotes, I was like, okay, now we're indulging in all of my maximalist impulses. This text is going to be ridiculous. There are going to be epigraphs, there's going to be footnotes, there's going to be a footnote that's an entire chapter that is also a newspaper clipping, and I'm just amazed that my editors let me get away with it all. But on a more technical craft level, I think the footnotes of BABEL, they function to give the reader an additional perspective removed from the space and time that the characters are located in. So in the main text, your point of view character is Robin. He's the protagonist, and he's an unreliable narrator, and he's also a very limited narrator in that he doesn't understand the tapestry of history that he's situated in. Nobody does, because history is so complicated and the world is so complicated. So he has very skewed perspectives on things, and there's also so much he's missing, especially things that are going on in the inner lives of even members of his cohort that he imagines himself very close to. So Robin is missing a large part of the picture, but the narrator of the footnotes has the benefit of hindsight, and she is located at least a decade later, if not several, and she's able to point out some of his blind spots, and she's able to whisper to the reader some of the unfortunate oversights he makes. And she's also able to make very snide comments about how colonialism and imperialism manifested in that era that Robin doesn't see. So it was fun playing and toggling between those two different voices. And it's especially fun in the audiobook because I managed to convince them to get a second narrator for the footnotes. The main text is by a male voice actor, and the footnote text is by a woman. So there is that jarring disconnect when it switches to the footnotes when you're listening, and I think it really works.
Yeah, I read BABEL halfway, or like parts of it through physical book, and then another part in like audiobook, or was trying to read both at the same time. And when I first listened to the audiobook, I was like, whoa, it feels like the footnotes are almost like whispering to you, and Robin's like, blah, 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 this is what, like, how I'm thinking. And then the footnote comes in and she's like, actually, historically, this is what happened. And it was just like very fun to experience. And I really, really, really enjoyed it. You did mention that you wanted to include the footnotes because you're like, oh, here's all this interesting stuff that I found in my research. But were there any things that you still weren't able to include in the footnotes that you kind of like wish you would have included, or like maybe even just like wish people could know about, or just any fun things that you learned?
I could have gone deeper into the weeds of translation theory. I'd written like just so many lectures about how it works and the mechanics of translation and the craft and particular techniques that you can employ and all sorts of translation philosophies. But there were two helpful barriers to putting all of this in. The first was that I had to be careful not to include perspectives on translation that postdated my characters. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff done, especially in the 20th century, I think, really critical perspectives on how we approach translation and how we bring texts from places imbued with less literary capital into English. But those debates are not debates that our characters would have been having. They would have had proto versions of those debates. So those lectures, which I had written and which were finished, could not go in the main text, but they're helpful for me to know. And the second thing is I have editors who care about pacing and want my books to be commercially successful. So they were like, no reader is going to read all of this. Like you get like 3 profound Playfair lectures max. So pick and choose like what is especially important and what you can cut out. So all the nitty gritty stuff about etymology got left out of the book. And even so, there are still people who are complaining that it reads too much. There are too many lectures in the novel. So I think that's a line I will always have to walk and struggle with, because I think the deeper that I get into my academic career, the more I lose grip on what is interesting to me as a scholar and what I could read pages and pages of, and what the average reader has the patience to read pages and pages of. So I predict much more cuts to manuscripts in the future. I'm working on my 6th novel right now, and it has a lot of back and forths between Plato and Aristotle. And my fiance was teaching me modal logic on our whiteboard earlier today. And I was like, how can I put some of this in the text? And I really think like at least 50% of all of this is going to be cut, because there's no way anyone casually browsing in a bookstore actually wants to read all of that.
We do.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was like,
I
would disagree. Yeah, definitely. I love Babel, but then I would also argue for your point where it's like, I would also love to read a lot of the research that you put in and all of like the interesting things that you learned about. And I was like, oh, I wish there's a little bit more, but the story must continue. Segueing into our next question, you've mentioned in past interviews that Babel is partly inspired by your dad's time at Beta and the students' revolutions in Hong Kong. How did these historical events shape your perspectives as you were writing Babel?
I think about student revolutions a lot, and I think one aesthetic influence that is a bit embarrassing is that I'm one of the people whose high school identity was really defined by the 2012 Les Mis film adaptation, which I've loved that musical forever, and there's just something about handsome young revolutionaries getting together in cafes and singing about their feelings and having homoerotic interactions and then dying in a blaze of glory. So I think I'd always romanticized the idea of the student martyr in that very silly, frivolous sense. But my dad's time at Tiananmen, I don't even remember the first time I heard his story about this. I feel like it's always been with with me, and he has always instilled in me these very passionate principles of standing for what you believe in and using your platform and using your voice to speak out against injustice, because he lived through one of the most tragic instances of that. And instead of making him quiet and made him bolder, and I always thought that was very admirable. So there's a period in which I was reading about student revolutions across history, not just the violent ones, but a lot of critical social movements were started by students in the 50s and 60s, the wave of anti-imperialism and decolonization after World War II, and the spread of, or really the creation of, the global left. A lot of that comes down to students. And I have wondered for a long time why students, and are student revolutions in fact successful? And this is tricky because the student in a lot of ways is the least effective revolutionary. They're naive, they're young, they don't really understand how the world works. So they have idealized visions of how to change the world. They don't have guns and they're not trained soldiers, so it's very easy to mow them down in the streets, and student revolutions fail tragically for precisely this reason. But I think the student's weakness is also his greatest asset, the fact that they do have those romantic visions of how the world could be different, that idealism, that willing to dream a better future that everyone else might be too jaded or pragmatic to imagine. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think student revolutions end up having all of this lasting symbolic power that spreads across space and time. So sitting at the nexus of all of those questions, I think that permeates everything that lies at the bottom of Babel.
Big brain energy every time. I was like just taking it all in. I think that's what makes this book so wonderful. It's like you're pulling in so many of your previous experience, historical events, and essentially like presenting Babel as it unlocks all of these. I don't know. I was just like, oh, what Robin's going through, what everyone in the cohort is going through is just so intense. And as everyone I talked to who's reading it was like, as you deconstruct their romanticized vision of academia and eventually become student revolutionaries, it was just really inspiring to read about, because it's never easy to do what's right sometimes. But speaking of that, as this is your first novel outside of the Poppy Wars series, how has the transition been from writing fantasy or epic fantasy to writing Babel? We talked to Ken Liu, who was our last book of the month, which was The Paper Menagerie, and he was like, oh, that's so great that you guys are reading Babel. This is definitely Rebecca's like best work yet. So we have seen your growth as a reader. As a writer, many people have also seen that as well. How do you feel now that you've changed genres, or it's been some time since you first debuted?
Ken is too kind, and the Paper Menagerie is incredible. I'm very happy to be done with the Poppy Word trilogy. It occupied such a long period of my life, I think. I started writing it in 2016, and the last book came out in 2020. And that's about 4 or 5 years of my life, which is a very long time, no matter how old you are. But I think particularly between the ages of 19 and 24, which is how old I was when I started and when the last book came out, that's a period of tremendous growth and change. I think it's when you graduate college and get your first job and move out and are on your own in the world and developing a stable adult identity and figuring out who you are. And I was changing so much, but I was working on the same trilogy that I'd begun when I was a teenager, and I felt trapped by it in a lot of ways. And I think you can see the change across successive books in which I'm trying out new ideas and changing my opinion on things that were expressed in earlier books and employing different prose styles and different forms of characterization. I feel very lucky in that I had a readership that let me grow up on the page with those novels, but they also feel like a very especially the first book, it feels very juvenile, and that's because it was. It's because it was literally written by a teenager. And Babel felt like a fresh start. I was able to come up with a new cast of characters, new arguments, and it was the first book that I started writing as a grad student. I guess I worked on The Dragon Republic and The Burning God as a grad student also, but it's different because those characters and that world, came from undergrad, and I felt like I had a much more solid grasp on a whole host of concepts. And just like technically and structurally, it's more ambitious. It attempts a Bildungsroman over 5 acts, which is something that none of the Poppy War books could have done. And I think it has a lot more complicated character interactions, especially within the cohort, that are more subtle and nuanced and ambivalent versus the rather stark ideological contrast between characters in the Poppy War trilogy. So all of that, it was just so nice to be able to grow up and write my first fully adult book as an adult. And it was nice also for the conversation about my work to finally not be this author is so young, etc. I think growing up is the best thing that ever happened to my publishing career, because now I'm not like infantilized by reviewers and by an audience, and people no longer assume my work is YA. Babel's the first book that came out, and everyone just took it seriously as a work of fiction instead of being suspicious that it was written by someone who was young, and that was great. So I'm in a place of constant experimentation right now. I wrote my big epic historical fantasy, and I don't think I'll do historical fantasy for a little while. I wrote like a breezy, gossipy litfic novel that will come out in May, and that's completely different in tone and style from Babel. And the thing I'm working on right now is different to all of that. It's about philosophy and logic puzzles and paradoxes and science and math, which, if you told me I was going to work on a math book like 3 years ago, I'm terrible at math, so I would have been stunned. And the narration style, again, is very different. It's closer to Terry Pratchett than Susanna Clarke, and I think Susanna Clarke is the obvious comp for Babel. So I think I'm in a space now where I want to try something completely different with each book and push my creative boundaries and try out all these voices. And I don't want to have an author brand that's like, Ara Kuang writes this kind of book. I just want to do everything. And being free of the Poppy War trilogy is what has let me experiment with each new novel. So I'm really happy to be here.
That's so cool that you say that, because I was thinking, I wonder if she goes into each book wanting to try something different, and it sounds like it is.
Oh yeah, it's like inventing new personalities with the seasons, inventing new personalities with each novel.
I love it. I'm so excited to like be on this journey of like reading all of like, as I'm reading the Poppy War and then now Babel, and then your new book that's coming out and all your future works that are coming out. I'm excited to be on this journey. Yay. Okay, so we will be moving into some plot and characters and specific spoiler questions. So if you have not read Babel, we suggest you to leave now and come back later. We will have this video saved on our YouTube. You can watch it after you finish the book. So that said, Babel follows a cohort of characters in academia. Is there a particular character that you see yourself in, or is there a part of you in each of your cohort? And I feel like this also kind of ties in with the last question, where it's like, oh, you're trying out new characters in the sense of like different types of books. And so is there a particular character in Babel that shines out?
I think Robin is the closest to me, just because his positionality and his language specialties and ways in which it's easy and difficult for him to move through the world are the most parallel to what I know from personal experience. So he was a convenient main character, and a very strategic one too, when you think about writing a book set in 1830s England, because it's hard enough as an American writing a book about England. I feel like I've read so many cringy attempts at getting English slang right and describing London, and you always can tell the difference between an American's false version of England and England as written by someone from there. And I knew I needed to gain my readers' trust and not throw them off with a clearly false representation of England. So my cheat for that was to have a main character who's also an outsider, like I was, who doesn't understand the social codes, who doesn't understand the slang. To Robin, everything he encounters about England is new and interesting and weird. So this is one of the seminal rules for doing world building as well. When you're doing exposition about how your world works, you tell the information that your character would have, that would be new to your character, not that would have been new to the reader. Because if you do too much, like, and the world like works like this, and there are these social conventions, like food works like this, like it's very weird if your POV character has grown up in that, because this should all be background knowledge to them. But it's not to Robin, so it allowed me that freedom of writing as an outsider on the border looking in. So he's very near and dear to my heart. But I think with all of the other characters, even the characters I despise, I try to put a little piece of my heart in them, because if I can't empathize with that character, and if I can't see something that drives them, that is at the beating heart of what hurts them and what inspires them and what they love, then they're not going to come off as a three-dimensional, interesting character. So even Letty, who is just awful, I had to think hard about how it is easy sometimes to just attribute, to draw parallels between your own marginalization and the marginalization of others, and to take refuge in your dual status as someone who is marginalized and someone who comparatively has a lot of privilege compared to everybody else. And Letty does do this, but I don't think it is as strategic or cold-blooded or sociopathic as Robin believes that it is. I think this is just what how she's been socialized to act. So I mean, yeah, it's not fun being in her head. I think she's wrong about basically everything, but she had to feel believable.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I feel like it was very interesting, and I really appreciated that you put in a chapter with Letty's perspective, where she was kind of like going through like her mentality of like why she ended up shooting Rami, and like all of these things, where it's like if you only see it from Robin's perspective, he's like, oh, she intentionally did this, which, you know, she kind of did. But Letty is a whole other thing.
Yeah. We do have a Letty question, so I'm just going to ask it right now. So Letty's ending, though disappointing and upsetting, was also fairly predictable for many of us as readers, because I think a lot of us during our discussions were floating this topic of white feminism. So we kind of know why it was important for her to kill Rami, but did you ever envision an alternate ending for her? Also, big spoilers, but I already asked the question.
No, I kind of knew what Letty was going to do the moment I came up with her. And I think here I really wanted to explore the contradictions and divides between the suffragettes movement and abolition, because there were places in which coalitions were formed and strategic partnerships were made, and there are also places in which white women threw everybody else under the bus. And this happens periodically throughout history. So Letty had to be the human instantiation of that. Particularly, so I didn't envision a different ending for Letty, because this text is acting as an intervention, I think, to the dominant form of representation of white women in Victorian pastiche fiction, in which it's always about women's empowerment and how hard it is to be a pretty white woman in the 1830s, and how hard it is not to be able to get an education and to be forced into marriage and not to be taken seriously by doctors and not having the right to vote, etc. And all of those things are horrible. I'm also tired of them being like the only type of protagonist that is able to challenge power dynamics and social norms as represented in our Victorian fiction, because there's so much else going on, right? Victorian London is so much more colorful and interesting than I think most words in that canon would lead us to believe. So it was important that Letty was an instance of those coalitions failing, rather than just another, like uppity white woman who fights the power and speaks out against the man or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. But along those lines, we had another question that was kind of like it was from one of our book club members, and it's not necessarily like arguing for Letty, but I'll just say the question. While the title of the book emphasizes the necessity of violence, a number of the characters' opinions fluctuate on the matter. Why was it important for you to highlight the violence when fighting against a regime, considering there are examples of peaceful revolts like Gandhi and the Arab Spring? And obviously, with Letty as a character, she greatly argues with Robin in the end about like, oh, we could do this without violence. So yeah.
I don't think there is a right answer to the question of is violence just? Do we always need to use violence? I think you always choose the tactics that are available to you and are proven to be successful or have the potential of succeeding in your particular contexts. I think with the necessity of violence in this story and the conclusion that Robin lands on, that is all pulled from Frantz Fanon's arguments in The Wretched of the Earth, the chapter on violence, where he argues that in the context of these decolonial wars of liberation, there is no other option. You have to go to war because there's nothing else that brings the colonizer to the negotiating table. They would never do it out of altruistic motivations. They'll never magically wake up and have a change of heart. You have to impact the bottom line, and you have to violence shocks the system, and the system cannot sustain the shock. That's the line that Fanon writes, and something that Griffin later echoes. And indeed, if we look at how things shook out in the wake of World War II, all of these liberation movements were only possible because of violent revolution. And I mean, it's complicated, obviously. It makes people uncomfortable. There are cases in which it goes too far. There's a very thin line, right, between violence as articulated by Fanon and our characters and terrorism, which is a whole other can of worms of moral dilemmas. So I think, right, there is a place for peaceful revolution. There's also a place for picking up a gun, and that's where Griffin and Robin fall. And I think in the context of this story, this ends up being the only answer because they tried all the peaceful options, and then book 4 happened.
Yes.
I'm ready to reread this book like right now. I'm so obsessed, especially after you said the whole violence shocks the system quote. That one is like, I was like, underline, highlight. I loved it. So our lovely, unreliable narrator, Robin Swift, undergoes major character development, and we joked in like our book club discussion, it was like his own Rin spiral, you could say. With that, the ending of Babel was heartbreaking, but also an event that was heavily foreshadowed. What was the significance of having Rumble crumble with the tower and really having only Victoire survive outside of the cohort of characters?
Well, I've been told that I can't just kill everyone. There always has to be someone who survives. When I was trying to decide who left the tower, I had two contradictory impulses. The first is I did want to make it clear what the sacrifices of these choices were, and I don't like clean, happy endings where our protagonists win and get away with everything. That just seems unrealistic and totally inappropriate. On the other hand, so we can get into spoilers now, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the conversation between Robin and Victoire, where he asks her, "Are you going to stay with me?" and she ends up saying, "No, I want to live." She brings up this poem by the abolitionists Bicknell and Day, which, and these are two white abolitionists romanticizing the death of a slave, and using this as a propaganda tool to further a just cause of abolition. But as Victoire rightly points out, it's ridiculous that only her death should have that kind of symbolic power. It's ridiculous that she has to die to get white people's sympathy, and she doesn't want to be that lacquer figure of martyrdom. She doesn't want it to be necessary that her life ends so that she can be transformed into something with revolutionary potential. She doesn't see that as necessary for change, and is actually, it's quite a racist tactic actually to assume that only her death could have meaning. So she wants to live, she wants to escape, and even if she never lifted a finger to help anyone ever again, the fact of her existence would be a victory in and of itself. The fact that she's named Victoire has like so many levels of significance, but that is one of them. So I needed for her to get out and for her to have that open ending, because she refuses to be a lovely symbol of martyrdom. There are so many more possibilities open to her, and she refuses to let all of that be foreclosed for the sake of this symbolic gesture. And Robin understands this, but he just, at that point in the story, he just can't find the will to keep going anymore. So that's where their paths diverge. And that was a tough chapter to write, but I think it was the right choice for those characters.
Yeah, for sure. When I was reading it, I was like, this hurts so much, but at the same time, it is like, so it's like the perfect ending in my eyes, because it's like I can't imagine it going any other way without it being like, oh, it doesn't make sense for his character, or all these other issues that may come up where it's like, oh, this is the one that like makes the most sense and fits the best for the characters. So I'm a huge fan of the ending personally. You talked earlier about decolonization, and it's funny because I'm taking a class on colonization and decolonization. So as I was reading Babel and reading my academic texts, I was like, oh, I would love to like talk more because it fits together so perfectly. But storytelling, as we all know, is inherently political, and Babel is a critique on colonialism and conquest. It explicitly acknowledges how historical events were influenced by desires to gain power. Do you think it's possible to decolonize academia like the characters in Babel attempt?
There's a great paper, I believe it's by Tuck and Yang from a few years ago, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And the argument here is basically calls to decolonize the classroom, to decolonize your reading list, to decolonize your library. Don't really make a lot of sense. Like, that's such a strong word for really a very symbolic and frivolous gesture. I mean, just call it like diversify your reading list or whatever. But I think decolonization has very specific connotations of giving the land back, and liberation, and in other contexts, overthrow of colonial regimes, right? And none of that is going on when we add more books by a wide variety of authors to our reading list. So let us not kid ourselves that we're engaging in any important decolonial projects when we do that. I mean, I do think it is very important to expand what we read, right? But widening one's perspective in the classroom is like the very least that you can do. And calls to decolonize the classroom, as Tuck and Yang point out, often come as this like self-congratulatory, like really not so much of a sacrifice of saying, oh, like we've done this like symbolic surface level cosmetic work, which means that we don't have to do the actual hard stuff of asking who our knowledge benefits and who we're giving jobs to and what kind of research are producing and really what does the academy exist for. And those are much harder conversations. But yeah, read that paper. I'm very uncomfortable with the phrase decolonize the classroom and decolonize reading lists for those reasons.
Yeah, I think we did read that paper, and so we were talking about that in the classroom, and I was like halfway through Babel, and I was like, this is a matched pair, to say the least, as I was reading it. But yeah, I totally agree, and that was kind of like one of the conclusions that we came up during class, so it's very, very, very interesting. But another thing that we pointed out during class, not to like get too academic about it, but was like, oh, although decolonize is about like giving back the land, how do you think like in academia could we potentially balance out like the effects of the colonization aside from like diversifying our reading lists?
I've been seeing some interesting conversations going on online between scholars really grappling with the question of how do you deal with the fact that the university is in a lot of ways just a neoliberal machine. And I think what everyone has come down on is there really is no way to rehabilitate the academy. Certain financial structures and incentives are in place to promote certain kinds of research, and we should all just stop kidding ourselves that anyone is doing anything properly radical from within the university. And I saw an interesting answer that was, and I'm paraphrasing it, but the argument is basically then you should just stop making the university the entirety of what you do. You produce your research during the hours that you're contracted to, and then in the rest of the time you take those resources that you get from the university, that access to libraries, right, like the stipends, the ability to draw on all of this knowledge produced by others, and you do stuff outside of the classroom because that's what all of that theorizing is for. And I think this was a very helpful way to think about how to approach my academic career going forward, because I think we're just in such a late stage place of everything is broken to realistically think that there's going to be an organic reformation of the academy from the inside. I think the balance of power is just way too skewed. I don't know how that happens without drastic social changes like across the platform. But what we can do is not romanticize our identities as students and professors and think that producing papers and writing monographs is the be-all and end-all of everything. I think there is a lot of value to theorizing. This is like what I steep myself in reading constantly, but there's more value to acting on what you glean from those theoretical insights. And yeah, you just have to follow through on what you've learned. Otherwise, you're just practicing intellectual masturbation for nothing.
So well said. Thank you.
That was very insightful. So while the exclusion of Robin's Chinese name may be intentional, one of our book club members was really curious to know if you ever envisioned his name in your head while writing. So even though we may know, did you know? We may not know.
Questions that I don't answer. It's similar to the question, was Venka a traitor at the end of The Burning God? And people love asking me this as if I'm going to tell anyone the answer. But I think I've said several times, if it's not in the text, it's not supposed to be in the text. And the point is the ambiguity and the lack of information. And so similarly, I think the relevant creative decision in BABEL was not, did I come up with a name and then just decide not to include it, but rather, why did I choose to put that gap in the text? And I think the reasons for that are obvious.
Okay, transitioning into another question. Do you have a favorite side character? So maybe Griffin, Anthony, the professors, and how did their characters come to life?
I really love all of the members of the Hermes Society. I had fun with Kathy and Bimmel and Ilsa and Anthony because unlike the popular, in which all the characters are either fantasy, Chinese, or white, BABEL for once was a text where I got to have like a truly international cast of characters, and I have a truly international cast of friends. So I got to come up with all these side characters who are basically like one-to-one correlations with, I mean, one of my closest friends, her name is Katie O'Neill. So there's an Irish character named Kathy O'Neill in the text. And my fiance's best friend's name is Bimmel. So of course there's a Bimmel in BABEL. And yeah, it was just so fun filling out that cast list with folks we know. But I think Griffin holds a special place in my heart. So the reasoning behind the character type that Griffin occupies is in more classical Victorian Bildungsroman stories, there's often a failed older brother type character or a failed moral example. And so I'm thinking here of characters like monks from Oliver Twist or the Artful Dodger, or someone whose path that our protagonist could follow, but it would corrupt him, so they choose to disassociate themselves with that character instead. And so Griffin fills that archetype. He's the bad influence. He is literally the failed older brother. He's the first version of the Robin experiment that goes wrong. And since Babel is an inverted, or rather subverted, buildings for men, in which a lot of the tropes are turned on their heads, and the whole question of what kind of perfect Victorian subject do you want to assimilate to, becomes reframed as the question of, do you want to participate in this Victorian civil and moral order at all? Griffin then becomes an example of an alternate life that Robin could choose if only he can give up all the sacrifices, or all the cushy things that he's gotten used to during his life at Babel, in which he would have to sacrifice. So that's Griffin. I love him very much. I listened a bit to the audiobook on my flight to the UK, and I had to stop after a little bit because the narrator has made such an interesting choice in making Griffin very hot, and he just like employs this like very sexy, like low raspy growl every time he's doing Griffin's voice, and I was like, I have to stop. This can't continue. I'm going to listen to something else.
That is so funny.
That's so true, though. So true.
Yeah. Griffin is the hot older brother.
Like even the way that the like audiobook narrated, just the contrast between Griffin and Robin's voice whenever they're talking, I was like, ooh, Griffin.
Yeah.
So another question that we had was about basically the magic system within the book. We love seeing how a lot of your magic systems come to life, primarily in the Popular series, and now with this one, it really encapsulates the whole idea of what's lost in translation. So we would just love to, there's no like actual real question. It's more just like, we just want to hear you talk more about it because we love hearing you talk about how like the silver working, and like the translation pieces came together.
I think one approach I have towards all of my magic systems is I never wanted to feel like, ooh, magic, like something that's so cool and which everybody wants to do. Because I've always been very frustrated with magic systems, and I think Harry Potter's wizardry is the best example of this, which feel like they have absolutely no downsides, in which like if this magic exists, everybody should just long to use it all the time. Magic that feels twee and convenient and like a panacea to all world problems, but for whatever plot reasons has not been employed to solve the whole world's problems. I really don't like that in fantasy. So with the Popular trilogy, the magic system is horrifying and something that no one in their right mind would ever want to employ. The sacrifices are actually sacrifices. There are real costs to this magic, and the trade-off is almost never worth it, which does make it rare and unpredictable and frightening. With Babel, it's not quite the case that magic has so many costs that it's never practiced, but it's so mundane. It's not really even called magic by everyone in this world. There's a joke about how common people think it's magic, but it's not. It's just technology. And with silverworking, it just is a manifestation of all of the complex economic and forces of class and culture at play in the Industrial Revolution. So all of the innovations of that period and the ways in which they created huge technological leaps, but also put tons of people out of work and made social inequality so much worse, like all of those debates going on in the 1830s and 1840s, that is just, that all comes to a peak with the question of silverworking. It just is another one of the innovations that were popularized in that period. So, and it's for that reason that it blends so well into the world. And I think another feature that makes that magic feel so normal and everyday is the most magical thing about it. Translation is something that we have in our world. I think translation is inherently magical. If you think about it, the idea that you can communicate across cultures and across like time and space and bring texts that were written in Latin like hundreds, thousands of years ago, or hundreds rather, and bring them to readers today. That's incredible. It's literally, I think it is the closest thing we have to real magic translation. I mean, the fact that you can bring a novel written, intended only for readers in Chinese to an Anglophone audience, that's amazing. It just widens access to all of these stories and texts, and you can pry through history and figure out what they were talking about. And I think that's amazing. I think everyone should study a foreign language, and even the process of, I mean, what it does to you in terms of your identity and how you form relationships. I have wanted for a long time to write an essay about what it was like learning Japanese last year with a bunch of undergrads here, because I think the experience of meeting other people and making friends mediated through a third language that none of you are very good at is fascinating, because we take on new personalities in a language that we're not good at. And when you have a limited vocabulary to express yourself, I've often said, like, I can't lie in languages that I'm not good at. And what I mean by this is I don't have the semantic or lexical tools to add layers to my speech to modulate how I want to present myself. And yeah, I can't really tell white lies in Japanese. I don't know how, which means all I can do is reach for the most basic concepts that I do know and say very honest things like, I like movies. Do you like movies? And I think this kind of like mediated interaction can actually end up being more honest and open than if we were getting to know each other in English. And then you add in the other layer of the role play that language class asks you to do. I mean, part of practicing sentences and learning different grammar constructions that I think is very common across language classes is envisioning scenarios where you might use them and saying like, oh, I threw out the trash, my roommate threw out the trash on me, which in Japanese can be rendered as a passive instruction. You can turn almost anything passive to indicate that this other person did this and it was terrible to me. So there's a passive way of saying my roommate was singing in the shower, and it kind of translates to like, I was sung at by my roommate in the shower. Like this thing was done to me, I didn't like it. And I think that's so cool. And yeah, I don't even remember what the original question was. I just think languages are cool and moving between them is incredible.
Just curious, like you did a lot of translation work in Mandarin, but are there any other, you're learning Japanese, like we're curious to know like what languages you know and what languages you're hoping to learn.
So I have a bit of Japanese. Chinese is my best language. That's not English. I have a bit of Italian now because we spent most of the summer in Italy. And I think if you did high school Latin, almost all of the Romance languages are very easy to pick up because grammatically they are just easier versions of Latin. There is a joke in Babel in which Rami says, like, how hard could it be to learn French? It's Latin's flimsiest daughter. And I didn't really know French when I wrote this joke. I just had a hunch that it might be true. But I did this crazy thing over the summer called French for Reading. And it's this class that a lot of Yale grad students do. And the idea is that we just need to be able to read secondary source scholarship in other languages, but we don't need to speak those languages fluently, and we don't need to like engage in small talk in those languages. What matters is if you gave me a scientific article in French, that I'd be able to, with the help of a dictionary, be able to read it semi-fluently. So this course only teaches you grammar. You don't learn pronunciation or vocabulary. You don't go through conversation drills. You just get force-fed grammar, and you will learn like all the different verb endings, and you learn a bunch of like common words. And it works. That's the weirdest thing. Like by the end, I was like semi-confidently reading French newspaper articles and academic papers, which is crazy to me. I think like you could not drop me in Paris and expect me to have a conversation about like ordering a baguette, but you could give me a paper on like plant biology and a dictionary and like a couple of hours, and I could tell you what it's about.
That is so cool. I love listening to you talk about like language, and I love reading Babel and like the whole like everything about the match pairs and translating in general. Legitimately, I went to text my friend who studied linguistics in undergrad, and I was like, I think I want to study linguistics now, and I think I want to be a translator, but maybe it's just the book that I'm reading. But yes, it's all super fun. Languages are so interesting. I'm just curious, do you have like a favorite match pair that you thought of, or like one that you didn't include but you wish you could have included, or do you have a favorite word in any language?
Um, People kept asking me, so Sam Shannon asked me at my London launch event, what's your favorite word? And it's one of those questions similar to what's your favorite book? Or if you ask someone that on stage, they immediately forget every book they've read in their entire lives. So I was like, I don't know, Sam. Suddenly I've forgotten every word I've ever learned in the English language. And then it became a running joke for people to keep asking me what's my favorite word for the rest of the UK tour. And I was never able to respond until the very last event. And by this time, I was exhausted from being in a new city every day and being on trains every day. And I just wanted it to be over and to be back in my bed. And I remember walking through the gardens, and I was joking with my publicist about absconding to the gardens, never to be seen again. And I thought the word abscond is so funny because if you use it as a substitute for the word like went away or ran in like any social context, it makes it 10 times funnier. Like instead of being like, I went to the coffee shop after class, you could say, I absconded to the coffee shop after class, which is hilarious. So then I said at Bath, my favorite word is abscond, and I plan to abscond to my bed right after this. And I stand by that. It's a good word. It also, I think like the S hard C combination is really nice. And when you have that many consonants in a row, like the B, S, C, that's a lot of fun for it to roll off your tongue. Abscond, great word.
10 out of 10 word. I support.
We're gonna start incorporating into our like daily language now.
Yeah, I will start saying that starting from now. I'm going to abscond also to my bed after this.
Or it's just a funny way to excuse yourself at like parties or at the end of a meeting, being like, all right, thank you for your time. I'm going to abscond to the bathroom. And it's like, wow, she knows hard words like abscond. And then nobody notices you're gone.
Love it. Okay, transitioning into some final fun questions. Can you share what you're working on right now, or what readers can expect from you in the future? I know you hinted at this in the earlier in the interview, and we're very, very excited for Yellowface.
So Yellowface comes out in May. I have finished all of the edits on my side for that, so it's in production's hands now, and I hope I get to share some covers soon, and hopefully we can start dropping some galleys in the US. And I'm currently drafting my 6th book, which is my next fantasy novel, and it's set in hell. It's about students again. I'm thinking of it as, so it's part of the same contract as Babel. Babel was a 2-book contract, and this would be the 2nd. And I'm thinking of it not as a normal duology because there's no continuity between the characters or the setting of the worlds or anything, but as the second half of a more general dark academia duology, where if Babel focuses on historical and structural problems with the academy, then this novel focuses on interpersonal problems of what being in academia can do to you, what the pursuit of knowledge can do to you, and the kind of abuse that I think goes on specifically in academic settings. And it's also kind of a romance, which is new and interesting and fun for me. So that's the book that has a lot of logic, paradoxes, and riddles and math. It's very far out of my fields, which has made it lots of fun to write because it means that my fiance has to teach me modal logic on our whiteboard, and I get to ask dumb questions so that he can keep drawing on the whiteboard because I think he looks sexy when he does it.
That's so funny. Also, just side comment, like I think we all love the tweets you always make with your fiance. Just like, oh, what a cute dynamic. But when do you think this book will be more of us like, when can we read it kind of question? Like, when do you think it'll be published?
It's a 2024 book, and I have requested that it comes out in August because it's just more convenient for me when books come out in August, because I'm home from study abroad programs, but it's before the start of term, so I'm able to tour and do events. And yeah, Babel came out in August. It felt like a good month for that to come out, so probably August 24.
I'm so excited and ready.
So another question that we had was, as you're very much so ingrained in academia, if you yourself could teach a class on anything, what would it be?
Well, I am teaching 2 classes this semester. I'm teaching a writing workshop at Sarah Lawrence, and then I'm doing a lecture for the comp lit department at Brown. And I really should start working on that lecture because I do have no idea what I want it to be about. But for the Sarah Lawrence craft talk, I think well, I sent in the proposal, so I don't just think I'm locked into this now. I want to talk about imitating voices across styles and genres. I think that, especially early in your career, so much writing advice is geared towards figuring out your unique voice and developing your particular identity as an author. And I want to argue the opposite, that instead of locking yourself into a style early on, there's actually a lot of benefit in trying out all sorts of styles and reading broadly across genres that you never even thought you'd like. And I think there is a huge bet in writing imitatively, which we're taught not to do because we're taught not to sound too much like someone else. But I think the practice of reading a lot of someone's prose and then trying to figure out what's unique about their cadence and doing exercises where you try to replicate that can be very helpful. And this is what I did in the process of writing Babel. I did what I call vocal training, in that I read a lot of the Victorian canon and pastiches of that canon, so Susanna Clarke, obviously, and tried to write like Dickens for a while. And the final product doesn't sound precisely like Dickens, but it sounds more like Dickens than the Poppywood trilogy does.
Super interesting.
Okay.
I know. I was literally thinking that, but I was like, yeah, I don't know. I feel kind of intimidated but excited at the same time. Anyway, final question. What is a must-visit destination that you'd recommend in London or the UK in general?
London, there is I really hope it's still there. I don't know if COVID killed it, but when I was there, right outside King's Cross, there is a floating bookstore in the canal. It's called Words on Water, something like that. And there's so many houseboats around London. And the thing that always gets me about those boats is that they're so much bigger on the inside than they look on the outside. And I think it must be magic. But I've wandered into that bookstore and it really feels like a full-size bookstore on the inside. It's just happens to be floating. I think it's so cool.
I hope I can visit that
London
someday.
Yeah, I definitely will try to visit there.
So I think those are mainly all the questions that we had for you. Again, we're very, very thankful that you were able to join us. Many of our readers were very excited. It was like we have to read Babel. And I was like, no doubt about it. You don't even have to like pressure us because we are reading Babel. So thank you again for having us. Do you have any final messages you want to send to your readers, to your fans, to the book club members?
No, just thanks for reading and thank you for supporting this book. It's been a while since I had a book come out because with the Poppywood trilogy, I was on a book a year schedule, and then 2021 was the first time I didn't have a book come out, so I wasn't sure I was going to remember what the launch process is like. And normally it's so stressful, but this one has just been wonderful. People have been so great about their support of this book, and I'm just grateful. Thank you all for reading and struggling through Playfair's translation lectures, and yeah, having the patience to wade through this text with me. I feel so lucky that I have so many incredible, patient, nerdy readers.
We are definitely one or two of them at the very, very least. Thank you so much for your time, and that is all from us.
Woo! Wait, our
Thank you.
October book of the month
Oh.
is Fortunes of Jaded Women by Caroline Huynh. And we do have a live show date, and we will share that on social media. So yes, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.